So hopefully you had a chance to look through the syllabus. Pretty much from July 12th to August 22nd, we'll be seeing each other for a lot, quite a bit, 4 times a week. Monday and Wednesdays, we'll see each other online through Zoom. And then Tuesday and Thursday from 6 to 9:30 in lab, Mendel 43. My name is Gup Kimbu, and I'll be your instructor. My office is located in Mendel 100. The only way to get to that is on the side where the gallery is. Otherwise, you can't cross it. They blocked it out for construction, okay? Office hours, I'm usually available before or after class, as well as Wednesdays from 1 to 2:30, and also by appointment. My phone number is listed, and this is also my cell phone, so feel free to text me or call me, as well as email me. The book that I was told that was requested of you is the MERB Anatomy and Physiology, the 7th edition. The web page is going to be the Canvas site, and everything that I hand out will be posted on Canvas. The course objectives, I'll let you read that on your own. In terms of the comments, policies, and grades, this is the second in a 2-course sequence covering the structure and function of the human body. We're going to be looking at both the macroscopic as well as the microscopic level in terms of how the organ systems work. And in this sequence, we're going to be learning the second half of the body systems. So starting from the autonomic nervous system all the way to the reproductive system. Most of us enjoy anatomy and physiology, and we get to see its relevance to our everyday life experience, human health, as well as our chosen profession. Hopefully you'll find this as fascinating as I do, and as all of us who love anatomy and physiology. Okay. In terms of grades, there will be 4 online lecture quizzes. So essentially there's a lecture quiz every week except for the week that you have exams. There are 4 of them, and each of them are worth 4 points, totaling 16%. There are 2 lecture exams that are worth 15% each. There are 6 online laboratory quizzes that are worth 6% each. And I think for Jean, she had it as a pre-lab. I will have it as a post-lab. So once we finish the week out, you'll have from Friday until Sunday to take both the lecture and lab quizzes as a way to check in and make sure that you're understanding everything, okay? And instead of putting all the points into your exams or your quizzes, I divide the points up into 6 lab reports as well. So the 6 lab reports are worth 12%, and it's a nice way to synthesize what you've learned in lab. Notice I said synthesize and not summarize, okay? You will be submitting all the handouts, all the lab handouts that I give to you to do the lab, where you can record your observations, your experiments, and your findings. The lab reports, I'll give you a template as to what they should look like, but it's more of a synthesize than a summarize, okay? Can someone tell me the difference between synthesizing and summarizing? Hello? Can you hear me still?
I can hear you, but I don't think I can explain what synthesizing means.
Okay, I thought it was like my connection disconnected. So thank you for replying. Okay, so when you summarize something, you're just telling me what it is, like what your results are. Synthesizing is, I already know your results from your lab sheets that you'll be handing in, but synthesizing is where you're pulling it all together, okay? So let me give you an example. If you're writing a paper, summarizing is you read an article and you tell me what the article is about. Where synthesizing is you pull the things together in terms of what have you learned overall, Okay, so that's the difference between summarizing versus synthesizing. Summarizing is just you're copying everything from what you did to the lab report. We're synthesizing. I don't want any of that. I just want to know what you've learned from that. So for example, you did, let's say you did an experiment on reflexivity. Okay, so when you're doing you're recording your results. So summary would be telling me what the results are. Where synthesizing is, okay, now I see the results. What did you learn from the results? Did you learn that, yes, what I learned about the reflex arc was correct in terms of it had to go, you have the effector, you have the receptor, and so on. Okay, so that's synthesizing. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
That makes sense.
Awesome. Okay, and there'll be a template too. Okay, so then in terms of the final, you have a lab practical exam that's worth 16%, as well as a final comprehensive exam that's worth 20%. So I did try to move a lot of the point away from the final because I know how stressful that is, into the shorter quizzes, as well as the lab reports and the other lab exams. Any questions on the division of the grades? Okay. So lecture quizzes, there are 4 online lecture quizzes assigned throughout the course. They'll cover the current week's content. So we'll have, like, for example, we have lecture today, and then you'll have Friday to Sunday to take the quiz on this lecture. You'll also have a lab tomorrow, and then the lab quiz will be based on what we do tomorrow. And again, it will be open from Friday until Sunday. Okay. Each lecture quiz will have approximately 15 multiple choice questions. They're really low stakes, so use them as a learning tool in terms of, what did you get wrong? Why did you get it wrong? And figure out what the correct answer is so that you won't make the same mistake on the exam. Okay. Lecture exams. So regarding the lecture exams, the questions will cover the materials we discussed in the class meetings during these sessions or on the videos that I assigned for you. You're expected to know the material that we cover in detail, be prepared for exam. Your exams will be in person, okay? So for the days that we have exams on, usually they're on Mondays, I will have you come to class, and then you'll take the exam, and then I'll lecture, or you'll take the exam and I can give you a video lecture, because sometimes students aren't focused after they're taking their exam. So I'll let you decide what you want for that. Okay. If you cannot take the lecture exam at the regularly scheduled time, please notify me, and then we'll find an alternative time. Failure to notify me before the test or to reschedule the exam multiple times will result in a point deduction on your exam score. So typically it's about 5% per day. Your exams are about 40 multiple choice questions with 10 short answers. Please make sure to bring a number 2 pencil. Any questions on the lecture exams? Then the final comprehensive exam. The final exam will be entirely multiple choice. It will be comprehensive, covering the entire term. So everything from the autonomic nervous system to the reproductive system. In terms for lab, there are 6 online lab quizzes, and they have about 10 questions with a mix of types such as definitions, calculations, and fill in the blanks. They cover that current week's lab exercise. The quizzes will be available from Friday to Sunday. Lab reports. There will be 6 weekly lab reports assigned for the course. A separate handout will be with directions and format will be given to you tomorrow. Okay. So the lab reports are a synthesis of that week's experiment, findings, and conclusions, and they are due the following week on Tuesday. Any questions on the assignment so far? Then your lab practical exam. The lab practical exam will be held on the last day of class. You'll need to sign up for a time to take the exam because we'll have to kind of rotate through. We do have that 3.5 hour chunk in time. So I'll divide the class in half, and that way it's not so crowded. Not that our class is really that crowded anyways, but we'll figure it out when it comes to that time. There's some suggestions: study actively, study frequently, and enjoy the studying. In terms of student accessibility and accommodations, please make sure you contact, if you qualify, to contact for that. And then I'll adjust whatever the assignments are to fit the accommodations. So the tentative schedule, and this was last updated July 9th, and it may update again based on the course format as well as current events, okay? In general, both your lecture and lab quizzes will be available from Friday to Sunday. And make sure if there's lab handouts to print them before coming to lab. Like you have one for this week to print out on reflex and reaction time, okay? So this week is just an introduction. Then I'll cover the autonomic nervous system. And I know from teaching online, most of the time that I lose students' attention after about an hour and a half. So what I've done is that I'll lecture for the first half, and that way there's that, interaction as well as a chance for you to ask any questions. And then what I did is that I pulled out some videos from guest lectures on the endocrine system for you to watch on your own. So oftentimes we'll go only for an hour and a half, but at least there's that contact time, and I'll save the rest of the time for if any students have any questions or want to meet with me one-on-one. Okay. You can see that you'll have a lecture quiz 1 this week, lecture quiz 1 and lab quiz 1. It will be available from Friday to Sunday, and these are online on Canvas. Any questions so far?
So are you saying that the lecture quizzes will be on today's lecture and the 2 videos that you gave us?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Okay.
Can you talk more about the practical exam and like what that'll look like when we take it?
Absolutely. So the practical exam.
Yes.
There we go. Okay. So there will be a list just like you had in Anatomy and Physiology 1 with Jean. If you haven't had it, you'll see it soon. There's a list of structures that you're responsible for knowing. So the lab practical will be on the anatomical structures where you'll have to identify what they are. Okay. And there may be a few questions in terms of like, what did you learn from this experiment and so on. But it's mostly on anatomy, and then a little bit on, I think it was 60% on anatomy and 40% on the lab that you conducted throughout the term. Okay.
Okay. Is that like an oral exam, or is it just like still like writing it?
Yep, it's still writing. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So to clarify a little bit more, so essentially I'll have half of you start with like the questions, either the short answer, multiple choice questions, and then the other half do the walk around with the anatomy, identifying the structures on models or on pictures, and then you'll switch. That's usually how I've done it in the past. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Then week 2, we have the cardiovascular system. This one's going to be tight because there's a lot of things to lecture on. So there's the blood, the heart and blood vessels. And then you'll have that lecture, you'll have a lecture quiz 2 that covers those at the end of the week. Then for lab, we'll have 4 parts to do. One is the heart and blood vessel anatomy, the cardiovascular dynamic, the cardiovascular physiology, as well as the blood analysis. So that's going to be divided up into the 2 days. I am giving a presentation on the Thursday. So what I'm going to end up doing is moving the lab to Wednesday instead of having it on Thursday. Okay. So I'll be moving the lab to Wednesday instead of Thursday. And then on Thursday, that's when I'll give the second part of the lecture. Questions on that?
So that week we'll have in-person class on Tuesday and Wednesday, and then the online is Monday and Thursday.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Mhm. Then on week 3, we'll do the lymphatic system, immune system. It's a little bit less. There's only 2 chapters here, and that's because I need to save some time for the exam. So you'll have your first exam in week 3, and it'll be July 24th at 6 p.m. Okay. And then in the lab, whatever we don't finish here, I'm going to move over here. So there's some room, even though I'll be at the conference the previous week. Okay. Then week 4, you have respiratory and digestive, and then the 4 labs that correspond with the respiratory and digestive system. And then we'll go back to the lecture and quiz. Week 5, you'll have the urinary system, and then you'll have exam 2, which will cover the previous ones, chapter 19 to 23. That will be on August 7th at 6 p.m. in person. So make sure you come with a pencil, okay? And then you'll have the lab on the urinary anatomy, as well as the renal physiology and acid-base balance lab. And then you'll have the lab quiz as usual. Week 6, reproductive, followed by a quiz, and then reproductive anatomy and physiology. That's pretty much identifying the structures. And then lab quiz 6. And that's pretty much it. And then we come to week 7, which is the final week. And that you'll just have your comprehensive final exam followed by your lab practical exam. They'll be on 2 different days. One will be on Monday, and one will be on Tuesday. Questions? All right. So let me close that out. Here. Any questions before I go into the lecture? Okay. Are you able to see my PowerPoint okay? It should say Autonomic Nervous System, Chapter 14. Yeah, you can see my PowerPoint, yes?
Yep.
Okay, I have 2 screens on, so that's why I gotta make sure that the correct screen is showing up. Okay. All right. So let's do a quick review. So you have the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. What would number 1 be? Or what could number 1 be?
It could be the brain or the spinal cord.
Excellent. Brain and spinal cord. Okay. What would number 3 and 4 be? Let's go with number 3. What should number 3 be?
Is it the sensory division?
Yes. And under the sensory division, it can be divided into what 2 divisions?
Is one of them sensory motor?
Nope. So you have sensory here, and number 4 would be motor. So you're right there. But what about number 5 and 6? So once you go from peripheral nervous system down to sensory nervous system, is divided further into what? Have you heard of somatic before?
Yes.
Is it
It's the other one? Oh yeah.
So visceral and somatic. Okay. So you have the visceral sensory division as well as the somatic sensory division. Oftentimes people associate somatic with what? What characteristic? I'll give you a clue. Voluntary or involuntary? You have a 50-50 chance. Pick
Involuntary.
the opposite.
Oh, voluntary.
There you go. So somatic is often associated with voluntary, where visceral is often associated with involuntary. Okay. Number 4. What would number 4 be?
Autonomic.
Motor division.
Motor is actually the correct answer.
Oh,
Yep, but you're right. Keep that in mind. The motor division is divided further into 2. What would number 7 and 8 be? Let's start with 8. What should 8 be?
Is that somatic motor division?
It is. Very good. So it's the somatic motor division. In other words, it's things that you have voluntary control over. For example, if you're sending a message to your skeletal muscle, that would be a part of somatic motor division. Where number 7 would be what?
is this where the autonomic comes in?
That's exactly it. And you'll find that there's another name. It depends on what book you look at. It's known as the visceral motor division, or you're absolutely right. More common than not, it's also known as the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so where it says visceral motor division, a lot of times when you look at the way it's displayed in different books, it's actually used as autonomic nervous system. So you have the autonomic motor nervous system, and then you have the somatic motor division. Now within the autonomic nervous system, or in this case, what's in this box, visceral motor division, is divided even further. Do you know what it's divided into?
Is it sympathetic and parasympathetic?
Absolutely. Okay, so sympathetic and parasympathetic. And that's what we're going to spend the rest of the time in this chapter on. So this whole chapter is on just this last area right here. So we're going to spend the rest of the time talking about just this. Okay. Any questions on that? Okay. So this comes from your textbook. So if you have your textbook, this is actually what's used. You can see that there's a little difference in the terminology that's used. You can see that you have the central nervous system and then the peripheral nervous system, or the PNS for short. Here they use sensory afferent division and motor efferent division. So there's a difference in terminology. So if you see afferent or efferent, it is used to it's used to pair with the sensory and the motor. Okay. Then with the motor division, it's divided further, like we talked about before, the somatic motor division and the autonomic nervous system. In other words, the visceral motor. So it's the same thing, it's just called different things. And then within the autonomic nervous system, it's divided by the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. Okay, so take a look at this. Is that wide enough for you to see?
Yep.
Okay, so do some investigative work for me. Look at this and tell me what are some differences between somatic and autonomic nervous system. So what's the difference between this top bar right here and this bottom bar right here? I'll give you kind of a minute to think about it, and then I'll have you kind of shout out what it is. Okay, what are some things that you noticed?
It looks like the neuron from the somatic nervous system is connected, whereas the neurons in the autonomic nervous system are they're not connected, they're more signaling each other.
Excellent. Yeah. So within the, let me see, where's my pen? It's not showing up. That's right. So you can see that one of the major differences is how the neurons are set up, right? So within the somatic nervous system, you can see it's one neuron, right? One single neuron from the central nervous system to the target organ, or otherwise the effector organ. Where in the autonomic nervous system, it's always a two neuron chain. So from the central nervous system, there's an intermediate, or what we call the ganglion or the adrenal medulla, and then another neuron, then it reaches to the effector organ. So that's one major difference. It's the pathway. Somatic uses one single neuron, where autonomic uses two. Great. What's another difference?
Is it that like the somatic nervous system has a lot more myelin than the autonomic nervous system neurons?
Absolutely. What's the implication of that? You should have learned this in AP1. What's the implication of myelinated axons?
I don't remember personally.
That's okay. Anyone can help out.
I know that myelinated axons move more quickly than an unmyelinated axon, and they don't, something about they don't leak as much in the cell body, but I don't know if that exactly has to do with this.
It does, 100%. Great job. So heavily myelinated axons, the signal goes much faster because you don't lose as much of the signal as you would on an unmyelinated neuron. Okay, so that's definitely one major difference, is that the somatic nervous system goes much faster. So if your brain sends a signal, it goes right away, and the reaction time is relatively fast. Compared to the overall autonomic system, because it's not myelinated oftentimes, or it's lightly myelinated, and it has to go through two neurons, it's often a much slower response. Okay, so that's two differences that you've pulled together. It's perfect. What about some others?
This one's a bit more obvious, but the somatic nervous system appears to work in the effector organs like skeletal muscle, and then the autonomic nervous system appears to work more so in smooth muscle, and that looks like the heart and maybe for sure the heart and some other cardiac related muscles.
Absolutely. Sometimes the easiest solution is it. So definitely, okay? So the effector is different, okay? So somatic targets the skeletal muscle, where autonomic targets more of the smooth muscle as well as glands, like you had said, okay? Perfect. What's another difference? We're almost done. A couple more differences.
The somatic nervous system is only stimulatory, whereas the autonomic one is stimulatory and inhibitory.
Excellent. That's a huge point that we're going to spend the rest of the half the class on. That's exactly it. So somatic only is excitatory, where autonomic can either be excitatory or inhibitory. Okay. One more major difference.
Does it have to do with voluntary and involuntary movements?
It could. That's one I hadn't pulled out, but definitely. So somatic is always going to be voluntary and autonomic is involuntary. But what else in terms of like what you see here? But that you're right though. That is definitely one difference.
It looks like could this, I mean, just based off the chart, could it be that the neuron is directly going to a blood vessel?
So it can through the adrenal medulla. So that's definitely one. Okay. What else? But that kind of still contributes towards that two-step or two-neuron chain. One more major difference. I'll bring chocolate tomorrow to whoever can answer the last one.
Is it the neurotransmitters that it has?
Yes, who was that? Because I can't see who's talking.
Oh, Danielle.
Danielle, you get chocolate tomorrow. Yes. Okay.
Yay.
So it's the neurotransmitters. So you can see that in the somatic, it only uses ACH, acetylcholine. Where in the autonomic nervous system, you see that it uses two different neurotransmitters, right? Acetylcholine and what else? What's NE?
Norepinephrine.
Yes, it is. Very good. Great. Nice job. So to summarize what you all just said, so this is like your summary right here, because you came up with all of this. Some of the major differences between somatic and autonomic is one within the effectors. Somatic only affects the skeletal muscle, where autonomic affects the cardiac smooth muscle, as well as the glands. The pathway is different, right? So somatic uses a single motor neuron as well as its myelinated for rapid impulse conduction, where the autonomic nervous system uses a two neuron chain, whether it has to go from a preganglionic neuron to a postganglionic neuron and then to its effector, okay? A third difference is the effect of the neurotransmitters on the target organ. In terms of the somatic, it uses acetylcholine, which is always excitatory, where the autonomic nervous system uses the norepinephrine with sympathetic neurons and acetylcholine with parasympathetic neurons or fibers, okay? And the reaction can be mixed depending on what the receptors are on the target organ. For example, it could be one could cause excitatory, while the other one can cause inhibitory. Okay, it depends on the target, the receptors on the target organ itself. Questions on this? Okay. So focusing on the autonomic nervous system, we learned that there are two parts, right? There's the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. The parasympathetic is known as the rest and digest, and it's actually your default state. Because that's your dominant. Most of the time you're not, you're either resting or digesting. Okay. When you are in crisis or when there's a stressful situation, that's when your body mobilizes and kind of pulls all the blood to your muscles. And that's when the sympathetic nervous system is playing a role. It's your flight or fright. Or in other words, your flight or fight, actually. Some people call it fright, some people call it fight, depending on like whether they, because of the violence with fight, they removed it from fight to fright. Okay, but essentially it's when you're in stressful situations, this is the system that takes over, the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, now the two of them don't work separately. Okay, they actually have what's called dual innervation, where the two divisions counterbalance each other to keep the body in homeostatic or run smoothly. Okay. Questions about the two divisions between the parasympathetic and the sympathetic? Yeah. So here's a diagram to show that. You can see that homeostasis is a dynamic balance between the two autonomic branches, because you want to be able to rest and digest as well as survive in terms of fight or flight. Okay, so let me give you an example. Okay, so how many of you have ever walked in an alley that's really dark and you notice that your muscles just clench up? Yeah, anyone experience that?
My goosebumps.
No, like you're walking down and it's kind of scary and your muscles just like tense.
Oh.
That's good that you haven't haven't experienced that. Well, for example, if I'm traveling by myself and I'm in a dark alley and I'm walking, right, I notice that my shoulders tend to tense up. Okay, so I didn't tell it to tense up. Okay, so I did not tell it to tense up at all, but it did it by itself. So that would be an example of my flight or fight or sympathetic response, because my mind sent, in my mind, the environment seems fearful, right? So my fear triggered the sympathetic nervous system to ready myself to be able to run or fight if something should happen, or like something jumps out at me in the dark. Okay, where your flight and where your rest and digest. So let's say you eat a really large meal, like Thanksgiving's coming up. When you eat a really large meal, what happens to your body?
We get tired.
Yeah, you get lethargic, you get sleepy. And that's because your body's under the rest and digest, because you ate a large meal, so it's got to take the blood and pull it to your intestine to increase that digestion. Okay, and you get tired and you get sleepy. Okay, so that's an example of the parasympathetic. Okay, and you can see that most of the time you are under parasympathetic, and it's only during stressful situations that you kind of go into the sympathetic. Now, rarely do you ever go fully into the fight or flight response. Oftentimes you kind of go mildly into it, just kind of a preparation. So the parasympathetic, again, is the rest or digest branch of and it's the most dominant most of the time. And some examples of what happens is decreases your blood pressure and heart rate, so it slows your body down in general, conserves. That's kind of the point of the parasympathetic, is to conserve your energy, slow down your body's activity, and move all the blood from your muscles, not all, but move a majority of the blood into and focus on digestion. Okay. So that's why smooth muscle contraction, it leads to the smooth muscle contraction of the gastrointestinal tract. Your pupils often through the parasympathetic system contract, so that it allows you more for the near vision than the distance vision. So these are some examples of what the parasympathetic system would trigger. Where the sympathetic system, this is your flight or flee, or when you're exercising. Okay, in which case you're going to the impulses that are sent through your sympathetic nervous system can do things like increasing your heart rate. It increases the force of the ventricle contraction. Why would it want to do that? Why would your body want to increase force of the ventricle contraction?
Is that like a way that our bodies kind of like ignore like pain and stuff, like when we're really scared or like in an intense situation?
That's an interesting point. I think that what your point is more connected to the cortisol response, where it inhibits your immune system, and it also kind of gives you, numbs your body so that you can be more prepared for danger. With the increased force of the ventricle contraction, the more the ventricles contract, what's being pumped with the blood?
Oxygen.
Yes, that's exactly it. And why oxygen? What's the role of oxygen in our bodies? You should have learned this in the muscular system.
Or does it have to do with the tensing of the muscles to release?
No, you're getting closer though. You're getting into the muscle chapter.
For energy?
Yes. Do you remember aerobic respiration? So your body, your muscles produce the most amount of energy through aerobic respiration, which means it needs oxygen. So that's why when you're exercising, you increase your respiratory rate, but also the force of your ventricle contraction, so that it can move the maximum amount of oxygen to the cells of your body, okay? Another example of sympathetic nervous system is the vasodilation of your coronary blood vessels, as well as your skeletal muscle blood vessels. And again, that's to help move the blood, the nutrients, as well as the oxygen. Then on the other hand, you have the vasoconstriction of the peripheral blood vessels and the increased release of glucose from the liver and adipose, again, because you're trying to get that glucose, that nutrient, because in addition to oxygen to produce energy, you need the glucose, right? And then you want to pool a lot of the blood from your gastrointestinal tract, from your digestion to your muscles. And that's why the smooth muscles of the gastrointestinal tract relax, okay? So those are some examples of the actions that the sympathetic nervous system has on the body. Any questions on that? And so as I was saying before, digestion becomes a low priority when life and limb are threatened. So essentially when you sense danger, you know, your blood is going to pool to your muscles, okay? And then remember what I told you earlier in terms of, you know, are you 100% sympathetic nervous system? Usually not most of the time, okay? So in order for massive sympathetic discharge, it has to be mediated through the hypothalamus, and under crisis is when your body undergoes like the majority of all your signals coming from your sympathetic nervous system. So like, for example, during exercise, you're not really in a full responsive flight or fight. You're just, you know, certain things are being stimulated. For example, your respiration goes up, your blood is moving to your muscles, and so on for exercise, but not like a systematic throughout your whole body sympathetic response, okay? Questions? How's it going so far? Am I going too slow, too fast, or okay?
I think you're going at good speed.
Are we going to be able to access this PowerPoint after the
Absolutely. Yes, always. I will post these out always. This is that I have some activities in here and I don't want to ruin the surprise. So that's why I usually wait to post it. Normally I post my PowerPoints earlier on, but they're just straight lectures where I'm trying to move more to an active, you know, where you respond and I talk, so I don't bore you and make you fall asleep. So I will definitely post this though.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yeah. How about this one? Let's take some time to look at this. What are some differences? So here we're looking at the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so what are some observations you can pull from just this image? Take a few minutes to look. This is a little bit harder activity. Okay, what are some things that you noticed?
Being full in the parasympathetic, it includes the brainstem and the cranial. And is it like nerves from the brainstem going down to whatever those are on the side, the organs?
Great point. That is definitely one of the major differences, the site of origin. So in the parasympathetic, the majority of the signals are coming from the brainstem as well as from the sacrum. Where in the sympathetic, it's coming from where?
The T and lumbars, the
Yeah.
thoracic and lumbar.
Exactly. And that's why the sympathetic right here, the sympathetic nervous system is often, in terms of the site of origin, is referred to as the thoracolumbar. In other words, it includes the thorax as well as the lumbar, where the parasympathetic is referred to as the craniosacral. Craniosacral meaning it comes from the cranium as well as the sacral. Okay, so that's one major difference. What else?
The ganglionic fibers are long in the parasympathetic and then short in the sympathetic.
Love it, absolutely. So the relative length of the fiber, same thing. So the sympathetic, much shorter pre-ganglionic, but longer post-ganglionic, right? Where in the parasympathetic, it has a longer pre-ganglionic, where the post-ganglia is much shorter, okay? What's another difference? Last one's a little bit harder. And I will offer chocolate again. So Danielle got one. Who else is going to get another one?
Does it have to do with the location of the ganglia? So like the ganglia in the sympathetic are close to the spinal cord, and then in the parasympathetic, they're within or near the visceral effector organs.
Yes. Who was that?
It was Skylar.
Skylar. You rock, Skylar. That's absolutely it. That's the hardest one too. So most of the time students don't recognize that, but you're absolutely right. It's the ganglion, the location of the ganglia. You can see that the location of the ganglia is oftentimes in or near the actual effector itself in the parasympathetic, where in the sympathetic, it's near, it's closer to the spinal cord right here. Okay, so these right here are closer to the spinal cord. Okay, excellent job. And this is a summary of what you all just said. Site of origin, relative length of fiber, as well as location of ganglia. Excellent job. Okay, questions though, did that make sense?
Yeah, it made sense. And then now that we're actually looking at the picture, at first I didn't understand those lines, but yeah, it made sense.
Yeah, oftentimes we, as teachers, we assume that you understand what all these means, and that's why I'm like, no, that's not true. And that's why I'm, I like doing these activities where you get a chance to really see if you understand what the picture represents. Yeah. Okay. So to sum it up, because we kind of went through the major anatomical as well as physiological differences between the parasympathetic and sympathetic divisions, you can see that the origin, we talked about the origin, the location of the ganglia, the length. We skipped the Ramai communications, and hopefully we'll be able to get that later. If not, that's okay. We talked a little bit more, we talked about the functional roles as well as a little bit of the neurotransmitters, and we'll get into this a lot more, okay? So that's just kind of a summary of what we talked about so far. All right, let's have a breakout session. I'm going to divide you into two groups. Okay, you'll have 15 minutes to do this. Group 1 is in charge of the parasympathetic effects. Group 2 is in charge of the sympathetic effects. You have 10 minutes Sorry. So you have 15 minutes to do it, and then you have 10 minutes to present. So each group has about 5 minutes to present. And I'm hoping that I would like to hear the voice of everybody instead of just having one person talk about it. So here's a QR code. Go ahead and scan that, and it will take you to an assignment. And I did not open that assignment up yet. So give me a second. Let's see. You're probably going to get there before I do. But the assignment looks like this. Okay. So you're going to describe so group 1, I can't remember who I assigned what, but one group is going to describe the parasympathetic actions of these organs, include the specific nerve and the action. So for example, the eye, what nerve and what is its action? What does it do? Okay, so you're going to do that for all of these effectors. Okay, and here's a place for you to put your notes. Okay, and then group 2, you're responsible for the sympathetic. Did I put parasympathetic twice? Yep. So you're responsible for the sympathetic actions, include the specific nerve and action, and your notes can be right here. Okay, so I'll give you 15 minutes to do that. I will put you into breakout rooms. And don't worry about it, just share with what you have.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So we did the parasympathetic actions on these target organs. Don't think we made it past the stomach, but we had started at the top with the iris or the eye, which when the parasympathetic works, the eye stimulates the sphincter and the pupillae muscles, and then it constricts the pupils. Did anyone else want to share?
I can continue on a little bit. Why don't I jump to the submandibular and sublingual gland? So the parasympathetic action on these two glands is that it stimulates secretion of watery saliva. And then from there, we jumped to the heart. I don't think we necessarily wrote this out in the order that the image goes through. So I'm sorry about that if it gets confusing. But on the heart, specifically the coronary blood vessels, the parasympathetic division actually has no effect. But on the heart muscle, it decreases heart rate. And then in the liver, glucose is increased, or there's an increase of glucose uptake from the blood. And then from there, does anybody else want to take over? Leaving off on the liver, so next would be the gallbladder.
I just wanted to add the lacrimal gland and nasal mucosa. They just secrete activity. I don't know, like tears or something, or runny nose. Would either Marin or Panra go after?
I can do it. Okay, so we also did the gallbladder. I think it like excites, contracts to expel biles. And then we also did the lung where the parasympathetic actions constricts, I don't know how to say that word, but yeah. And then also for the stomach, it increased motility and amount of secretion by digestive organs, relaxes I think sphincters to allow foodstuffs to move through tract. And then Marin can say the last two.
And then the pancreas stimulates muscles, which makes the lens bulge for closer vision. Wait, that's not right. Anyways, and then the large intestine increases motility and amount of secretion by digestive organs, relaxes the sphincter to allow foodstuffs to move through the tract as well.
Yeah, I think you meant for the pancreas to be the iris. The lung.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's correct.
And that's all we had so far, Professor.
Awesome.
Blue.
Next group. Can someone share and then go through it as a group?
I can share my screen. Oh, actually, maybe I can't. Let's see. Okay, yeah, actually I can't, sorry.
That's okay. Someone from the group, or I can too. How about this? I'll share it and then your group can talk about it. I think I can share. Let me find it again. There we go. Okay, go ahead, take over.
So to begin with, we did the eye and we broke it into the iris and then the ciliary muscle. So for the iris, we said it stimulates dilator pupillae muscles and then dilates the pupils, whereas the ciliary muscle weakly inhibits the muscle and flattens the lens for far vision. And then blood vessels, we said it constricts most vessels and increases blood pressure, which constricts vessels of abdominal viscera and skin to divert the blood to muscles, brain, and heart when necessary. And then epinephrine weakly dilates the vessels of skeletal muscles during exercise. And then I'll give it away to someone else.
I can go next. The glands in the sympathetic actions, it inhibits secretory activity and constricts blood vessels supplying the glands. And then the salivary glands, it stimulates secretion of thick, viscous saliva. And in the sweat glands, it stimulates copious sweating. The cholinergic fibers, to be specific. And then I'll give it to someone else. I can go next. So for the heart, it dilates blood vessels, so it's vasodilation and increases rate and force of heartbeat. And for the lungs, it dilates the bronchioles. And then the liver and gallbladder, it inhibits the gallbladder. Oh, I was reading. Okay, I'll finish this one and then hand the last one off to someone. Stimulates the release of glucose to blood from liver, and then there's only one more left for the last one.
The last part we went to was the stomach, and for like the whole digestive system, it gets decreased during sympathetic, and it decreases the activity of the glands and the muscle. And we didn't get to the spleen or the kidney.
That's completely fine. Thank you. So what you just gave me was a summary. So if you were to synthesize it, what would you say? So for example, let's take the eye. I'm going to copy that and I'm going to paste it in here. What would you synthesize from these summaries?
You could synthesize that where like the parasympathetic typically like constricts, the other system like dilates.
Okay, so that's still a summary though.
Oh, okay.
But that's a good point though. You're on the right point. I'm just looking for a different word. So if I were to synthesize this, I would say that the parasympathetic and the sympathetic have opposing actions. Do you notice that?
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So, okay. Synthesizing is, okay. I don't,
Okay.
I'm like trying to understand because like summary is what Danielle said, and then synthesizing is just what we take from it.
Exactly. Yep. So Danielle was right in that in parasympathetic, it leads to the constriction of pupils versus what's different is that in the sympathetic, it causes the pupils to dilate. But what did you just tell me? You told me that they had opposing actions. That's the synthesis. Okay. And then you can even further go into like, give me an example of how they have opposing actions. For example, in the eye, para does this, para constricts versus sympathetic dilates as an example of how they're opposing each other. Okay, so hopefully I've given you some examples of that. Okay, good job. All right, so you can come back to this and fill it out later because you are responsible for knowing this information. Okay, let me close out of that. Okay, and you will always have access to it, so make sure you do take a look at that. Here is also a summary of what you just said, and it's nice to have a chart with kind of where they're next to each other, so you can really see where one constricts it, the other dilates it. Now, are all of them opposing actions though?
No.
They're not. Some are not opposing, they're just one has reactions and the other one doesn't. So for example, the rector pili muscle, the parasympathetic has no effect on it. It doesn't innervate it at all, where it does with a sympathetic. Okay. And in some, for example, in the vagina clitoris, it causes the erection as well as the contraction, and those are kind of similar actions. So in this case, it is actually cooperative effect. So in some cases, and actually in most cases, you have opposing reactions. There are a few cases where you have where just one is reacting, one is not. And then other cases where you have fewer cases where you have them actually cooperating with each other. So there's three effects that could happen, right? One opposing, one cooperating with each other, and one where it's just only one is affected and the other is not. It doesn't have effect on that organ. Okay, questions?
I have a question about that little mini assignment in class. So is that something you'd like us to complete?
It's not graded, it's just more for your, sometimes students like to do things in their own wording versus this table that I'm showing you right here. Oh, am I showing you the table still? Can you see table 14.5?
Yep, I can.
Awesome. Yeah. So what you just did essentially is your own sections of the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. Okay. But sometimes to have it in your own words makes it much more easy to understand. And that's why it's nice to keep both. It's not graded, but you will find this, I could pull this and make questions out of it for your exam, essentially. Okay. All right. Other questions? All right. How are we doing so far? Doing good? Too fast? Too slow?
So would us like synthesizing be like saying that the sympathetic affects like everything, whereas the parasympathetic doesn't?
That could definitely be one synthesis. Yeah. Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's noticing, so you have the results, but it's noticing the trends, the effectiveness of it, rather than just regurgitating me what the results are. That's perfect. Okay. All right. Moving on. So now we're going to talk about reflexes. So here's the base. So the basic reflex arc, you've already learned about this, right? Or hopefully you've learned about it in AMP1. Have 5 major steps. You have the receptor, you have the sensory neuron, the integration center where decisions are being made, the motor neuron, and then the effector. Okay, so that's the basic somatic reflex arch. Okay, so that's the somatic. Where with the visceral or the autonomic, you still have the same 5. Okay, so it's still the same 5, but where is the difference? Let's take a look at that. Take a minute to look at it and tell me where the difference is. Okay. What have you observed? What are some differences?
We are observing where the where it is affected. One is in the muscle and one is in the visceral.
Yeah, absolutely. So the effector is different, right? So you have the receptor and the effector are different. What else? Let me take a step back, actually. What are reflexes?
An involuntary movement. Or could be voluntary, I guess, too, but a response.
Yep. So reflexes happen really fast, right? And what the reason why they can happen really fast is that oftentimes they skip going all the way up to the brain to be processed. So they skip that process of going all the way down, I'm sorry, all the way up, right? And they can just, bypass that. So you can see here that in the somatic reflex arc that happens at, your jerk reaction, we're going to be doing that in lab actually. So you're going to be doing reflexes in lab. And so, for example, for me, for example, just like today, I banged my elbow against something, and when I banged my elbow, also my hand jerked up, right? So that would be an example of a somatic reflex arc, where it went from the receptor through the sensory neuron to an integration center, and that integration center essentially is that interneuron to be process the information. And then it sends out to the motor neuron and right to the muscles of my arm to jerk back. Okay. Now, that's the standard somatic reflex arc. Reflexes are something that happens really fast, and it bypasses going all the way up to your central nervous system. Decisions are made down to your spinal cord and so on. So that's what the standard for the somatic one is. Now, your visceral reflex has those same 5 steps, okay? So you still have to have a receptor, but this time in your internal organs, right? Your smooth muscle and your cardiac, where before it would be along your skin. It still has a sensory neuron, so that's pretty straightforward, okay? But look at the integration center. The integration center in this case, how is it different from the integration center in the somatic reflex arc?
It is in different locations.
Yes, exactly. Because here's this one, right? Can you see my arrow or my pointer? Okay, let me draw it on here. Okay. Here's this one. Here's this one. Okay. So the integration center could be different. Okay. In addition to that, the motor neuron here can be just a single neuron, where the motor neuron in autonomic nervous system goes through a 2-neuron chain. And we already talked about that, right? But I'm just kind of pointing out how significant that is. Okay, so that still plays a role in the reflexes and not just the regular the majority of the autonomic nervous system. Okay. All right. So to summarize that up, they do have the same components. So you have the receptor, sensory, integration, motor neuron, effector. But the difference in the visceral is that one, they have 2 consecutive neurons for the motor neuron. Let's be specific and write down motor neuron here. And the afferent fibers happen to be visceral, in other words, the location. Okay. And then the effector are different as well. So the effector for the somatic is always going to be skeletal. But here you're going to have smooth muscle, cardiac, and glands. Okay. So those are the major differences in reflexes. Okay. All right. Then let's move on and talk about neurotransmitters. Okay. So in neurotransmitters, you identified that there are 2 main ones. That's one of the differences that you mentioned earlier, right? You identified that there's acetylcholine. There you go. Okay. And norepinephrine, NE. Okay, so we're going to learn a little bit more about that. So acetylcholine specifically is released by cholinergic fibers. Okay, and these include mainly the preganglionic and the parasympathetic postganglionic fibers only. Okay, so the acetylcholine is associated mostly with the parasympathetic responses, where norepinephrine or noradrenaline, because adrenaline is essentially the same thing as epinephrine. It's just it was located in different locations, so they came up with 2 names, but it's the same chemical. Okay, so norepinephrine or noradrenaline, same thing, is released by adrenic fibers. Okay, what's important about that is that with this one, it's mainly associated with sympathetic nervous systems. Okay, the only exception to that is where the sympathetic postganglion fibers, that one uses acetylcholine instead of norepinephrine. Okay, let's take a look. Oh, I didn't insert the picture. Let me see if I can find a picture. Did I do that? Kind of. Okay. There's a really nice picture in your textbook, and for some reason I didn't include it. So I will include it after this lecture. Okay. But there's a really nice picture showing, actually, it's right here. Here, at the very beginning. So you can see that between the 2 neurotransmitters, you can see, like I said earlier, right, the norepinephrine right here. Yeah, it's not like, let me mark on there. Okay, so the norepinephrine is associated mostly with the sympathetic nervous system, whereas acetylcholine is associated with the parasympathetic. Okay, so that's essentially what it's saying. The only exception to that is within the sympathetic nervous system, it does use acetylcholine. Okay, rarely though. Okay, questions? So on a test, I asked you cholinergic fibers are associated with what neurotransmitter? What would you say?
Acetylcholine.
Excellent. Okay. And if I said, what autonomic nervous system is it associated? What would you say?
Parasympathetic.
Okay. That's a summary. So here's a synthesis question. What type of reaction does cholinergic result in?
Can you ask that one more time?
Sure. What type of reaction does cholinergic fibers produce? Result in?
Constrictive reactions. Is
It
that what we're
depends.
looking for?
I was looking for the rest and digest.
Oh,
Yep, because it's parasympathetic. Okay. If I ask instead the adrenergic fibers are associated with what type of reaction, what would you say?
it's fight or flight. Okay.
Fight or fight, exactly. So essentially it's stimulant where acetylcholine tends to be inhibitory depending on which organ you're looking at, right? Does that make sense? So let me give you an example. Okay, so you have the brain sends a signal, okay, and it wants to tell the heart to slow down. So the brain sends a signal to tell the heart to slow down. What autonomic nervous system would it send it through, and what neurotransmitter would it use? Okay, can you see the question okay?
So would it be the like acetylcholine and then the parasympathetic nervous system?
Tell us why.
Because so acetylcholine is associated with the parasympathetic nervous system, which is the rest and digest system.
You got it. Exactly. Did everyone understand that though? It's completely okay to say no. Okay, so let's go through that one more time. So the autonomic nervous system, right? So what division are we talking about? We want the heart to slow down. So that helps us to determine which division it is. Because norepinephrine or adrenaline or noradrenaline and adrenaline in general, okay, tends to speed things up. It's part of your flight or fight response. Where the parasympathetic is your rest and digest, and we learned that slows down the heart, right? So that's why the autonomic nervous system division that would be stimulated would be the parasympathetic. And because it's the parasympathetic is associated with what neurotransmitter? And that would be acetylcholine. Does that make sense?
Yep.
Okay, where if it's going to the stomach, if I want it to, let's say I change this and I want it to be the digestive tract to be stimulated. What autonomic nervous system would I use and what neurotransmitter? These are the types of questions you'd see on your exam. Give it a try. It's completely okay to be wrong here. You have 50-50.
So if we want the digestive tract to be stimulated, wouldn't we want acetylcholine
Yes,
by the parasympathetic?
absolutely. So that goes to point out this right here, that it depends on the receptor of the target organ, whether it's stimulatory or inhibitory. So where the parasympathetic nervous system right here that uses acetylcholine would slow down the heart, but it would actually increase the stomach. Why? Because the receptors along the digestive tract take acetylcholine as a stimulatory effect, where the receptors for acetylcholine in the heart would take it as a inhibitory effect. Does that make sense? Okay, and that's why to determine the effect, it depends on what? Even though we know the parasympathetic is the rest and digest, and the sympathetic is flight and fight, just because the sympathetic is flight or flight, it's not always stimulatory. Although most of the time it is, it's not always. The parasympathetic is normally inhibitory, but not always. So what determines the clause, the exception? The receptors on the actual organ itself. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Awesome. Yeah, that's one of the biggest concepts that's really difficult to understand, because students oftentimes associate parasympathetic as always inhibitory because it slows down your heart, it slows down your breathing, it's your rest, but it also is the rest and digest, right? So certain organs it will stimulate, or certain organs it will slow. And that's why the effect of this is based on the receptors at the target organ itself. Even though we learn about generically what they are, it depends. Okay? All right. So that brings us to this next slide, the neurotransmitters and the receptors. Okay? So the autonomic nervous system uses the two neurotransmitters that we talked about, but it also depends on the modulator. In other words, what's the receptor? So all autonomic preganglionic neurons use the acetylcholine. Okay. And of course, if it's using acetylcholine, it's going to be associated with the cholinergic. Okay. And these are oftentimes bind to the nicotinic receptors. Okay. Where most of the postganglionic sympathetic neurons, okay, will secrete norepinephrine. And if it's norepinephrine, it is then associated, it binds to the adrenergic receptors. Okay. And then on most postganglionic parasympathetic, it's going to be acetylcholine. And if it's acetylcholine, it's going to be the cholinergic. Okay. And with the postganglionic parasympathetic neurons, they're going to bind to what's called the muscarinic receptors. Okay. So lots of terminology here. Okay. So this portion right here refers to the receptors. So how many types of receptors do you have that we talked about so far? You have 3. Okay. And then depending on what type of neuron is going to release a neurotransmitter, and that neurotransmitter is always associated with a specific type. Okay. And then that type is what binds to a specific type of receptor on the target cell. Okay. This probably doesn't make any sense. Let me show you a picture. Here. All right. So you have the central nervous system. The central nervous system sends a signal. Okay. And then the signal reaches a ganglion. Okay. If it's the presynaptic or the preganglionic neuron is always going to release acetylcholine. Okay, that's what we said here. All autonomic preganglionic neurons will release acetylcholine. Okay, and that's what is shown here. They all, regardless of what, they always, the preganglionic will always release acetylcholine. The acetylcholine in the preganglionic will always bind to the postganglionic receptors called the nicotinic receptor. Okay, and that's what we said here. Okay, so preganglionic neurons release acetylcholine, and the acetylcholine from the preganglionic neuron binds to the nicotinic receptor. Okay, so that's what it's showing here. Now, the postganglionic, depending on whether it's parasympathetic or sympathetic, is going to release different neurotransmitter. One more time. The postganglionic fiber or neuron is going to release its specific neurotransmitter. The sympathetic is the sympathetic nervous system, or the sympathetic pathway uses the neuroepinephrine, where the parasympathetic postganglionic neuron uses acetylcholine. Okay, now the target cell will have the muscarinic receptor if it binds to acetylcholine. It will have the adrenergic receptor if it binds to the norepinephrine. Does this image help a little bit? Let me take that and put it up here.
So it's only the neurotransmitters that are binding?
Yes. Binding to what?
the target tissues, or no, the nicotinic receptors, or the, like, depending on what neurotransmitter it is, it has a certain receptor.
Yes. Yep. So you technically could divide it by this. Right? So the first one right here, is the preganglionic. So here, let me do this. This might help by doing this. So preganglionic neuron. Regardless of whether it is sympathetic or parasympathetic, uses what neurotransmitter? So all preganglionic neuron, this one on the top right here, the first one right here, from the central nervous system to the next neuron, all of them, regardless of whether it's sympathetic or parasympathetic, uses what neurotransmitter?
Acetylcholine.
Yes. Okay. So it all uses acetylcholine. Okay. And the only type that is associated with acetylcholine is cholinergic. Okay. Now specifically, the specific cholinergic receptor with the preganglionic neuron is referred to as the nicotinic receptor. Okay, so oftentimes I use these two terms interchangeably, acetylcholine and cholinergic. Okay, so acetylcholine and cholinergic is used interchangeably. If it's cholinergic, then you know it's acetylcholine. Okay. In a preganglionic neuron, what receptor does it have that would bind to the acetylcholine / cholinergic neurotransmitter? Nicotinic, right? Now, the postganglionic okay, the postganglionic neuron, so the second set right here. Okay, so you see the first set right here, the red and the blue with the central nervous system. Now we're looking at the second one right here, below that. So in the second one below that, okay, with the postganglionic neuron, now it depends on whether it's using the parasympathetic or the sympathetic pathway. If it's using the sympathetic pathway, it's going to secrete norepinephrine. Okay, and the norepinephrine is going to bind to what receptor? It's going to always bind to the adrenal receptors. Okay, where the parasympathetic system, the parasympathetic neurons, will release acetylcholine. And again, remember, we use the term acetylcholine and cholinergic interchangeably. So the acetylcholine or the cholinergic neurotransmitter will always bind to what? At this point in the postganglionic neuron, is going to bind to receptors called the muscarinic. Okay, it's just it's terminology. Okay, but it helps to see the picture to see the difference between the terminology. So you have the preganglionic neuron, and all of them are going to have the same reaction. All of them are going to release acetylcholine, and all of them are going to bind to nicotinic receptors. Where with the postganglionic neuron, it depends on whether it's a postganglionic neuron from the parasympathetic nervous system or from the sympathetic nervous system. If it's from the sympathetic, it's going to secrete norepinephrine, which binds to the adrenergic receptors. If it's the parasympathetic, it's going to secrete acetylcholine, which then binds to the muscarinic receptors. Okay. Does everyone understand that before I ask the next set of questions? Silence is not a good thing. Questions? Why don't you ask me questions? How about that? Okay. Sit on it, let it stew for a little bit, and then you can ask me questions in lab tomorrow, okay? All right. So in some autonomic pathways, the neurotransmitter determines the response of the target tissue. So that's what I was going to ask you on this one. In the postganglionic neuron, the sympathetic neuron that secretes the norepinephrine, will it have inhibitory, stimulatory, or it depends effects? One more time. In the postsynaptic neuron that receive the signals from the sympathetic neuron or a sympathetic pathway, will that lead to inhibitory, stimulatory, or it depends effects? It should be depends, right? And what does it depend on? It depends on the target tissue. Okay, so to add a little bit more to that, with the adrenic receptors, there are two types of adrenic receptors. There's the alpha adrenic receptor and the beta, okay? And depending on which one, it's going to lead to different actions. So the alpha often leads to constriction, and the beta often leads to dilation. Okay, so it depends on what receptor that target organ has for the neurotransmitter receptor. Okay, and this is the adrenic receptor one. So it's only applying to which one, the sympathetic or parasympathetic. Make a guess, 50-50. So one more time, okay? So in the case of adrenic receptors, okay, overall, are we talking about the parasympathetic nervous system or the sympathetic nervous system? That's my first layer question.
Sarah.
Which one?
Sarah.
So,
Or,
yeah, go ahead.
That was your question, right? Which one was it?
Yep. So which autonomic nervous system pathway has to deal with the adrenic receptors?
Oh. Sympathetic.
Yes, exactly. So really in here, we're talking about the sympathetic pathway. Okay, so we're talking about the sympathetic pathway. In other words, it's your flight or fight response. So within your flight or fight response, which always will bind to the adrenic receptors on the target organs, okay? Within the adrenic receptors, there are two types. There's alpha and then there's beta. The alpha one, if it's an alpha receptor that's available to bind to the norepinephrine, it's going to lead to constriction. If it's a beta receptor that binds to that norepinephrine, it's going to lead to dilation. Okay? So that's what you're seeing here. So epinephrine, when you have epinephrine binding to the alpha, if you have the epinephrine or the norepinephrine, they're used interchangeably, bind to the alpha adrenic receptor right here, you have constriction. If it's a beta receptor, then it leads to vasodilation. How many of you have heard of beta blockers? Anyone work with patients or know people with heart issues that have to be on beta blockers?
Yes.
Yeah, this is why. So a beta blocker would prevent this receptor from binding to epinephrine. And if it doesn't bind to epinephrine, the blood vessel stays constricted. Okay? Question? Okay? All right. So here's a nice graph of showing you the different types of neurotransmitters and then the receptor types. So you can see that the receptor types are cholinergic and adrenergic. Sorry, my pronunciation is horrible. Adrenergic. Okay? So within the cholinergic, you know that that's always with acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is always associated with the cholinergic. Okay? Norepinephrine and epinephrine is associated with the adrenergic. Okay, and again, within the adrenergic, there are two types. There's alpha and there's beta. Alpha always leads to what again? Constriction or dilation?
Constriction.
Yes. Beta always leads to dilation. Okay. So that is what we're talking about here. Okay. Where with the acetylcholine, with the cholinergic receptor types, there's two kinds. There's the nicotinic and the muscarinic. Where did you learn about these two types? Let's start with the nicotinic. Where did you hear about that? Let me move back here. You saw it with the preganglionic neuron. Okay. Here it's showing you that this time you will also find it in the postganglionic. Okay. The other type is the muscarinic. Okay. So if it's the muscarinic, it's always associated with the parasympathetic. Okay, and very limited sympathetic. Okay. Okay, so this is just a chart to help you kind of remember the different types of neurotransmitters, their receptor types, the location and the effects of that specific neurotransmitter on that receptor. Okay, true or false? Knowing the neurotransmitter will always let you know the effect. True or false?
False,
Yes, false. Why is it false?
because it also depends on the receptor type.
Woohoo! Thank you. Exactly. Oh, you made my night. I was getting a little scared. I'm like, oh no, they're not talking. I've lost them. Yes, you got it. Okay. So not only does it depend on the neurotransmitter, but it also depends on the receptor that determines whether it's inhibitory or excitatory. Okay. All right. That was the main purpose, as well as having you see the different types of neurotransmitters so that you can remember them. Here's a complicated one, but it's nice because it shows you all the different pathways. This one is probably a really good one to study and see if you can make sense of it, okay? So here's the somatic pathway. Somatic pathways always use acetylcholine. And if it's using acetylcholine, it's always got to be a cholinergic, right? And if it's cholinergic, then it's got to be a nicotinic receptor. That's what the previous slide told us, right? This slide right here. Okay. Now, if it's parasympathetic, it is always going to use what? In the, so parasympathetic pathway, pre-ganglionic neuron. Automatically, you will always answer what neurotransmitter?
No epinephrine,
The other one.
acetylcholine.
Yes. Remember? All pre-ganglionic neuron will release acetylcholine. And if it's releasing acetylcholine, it always binds to what receptor?
Cholinergic.
Yes, absolutely. But what type of effector receptor will it bind?
Literally screaming.
Huh?
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't know I was unmuted.
Oh no, it's okay. That woke everyone up. So thank you. So nicotinic receptor. Okay. Then in the post-ganglionic neuron, it will continue to use what because it's parasympathetic?
Nicotinic receptors.
This one's different. This is because this is the post-ganglionic. It's going to continue to use acetylcholine as its neurotransmitter, but this time, because it's at the effector, it's going to bind to muscarinic receptors. That's the parasympathetic pathway. The brain sends a signal to the heart, for example. Okay, and that signal travels through this pre-ganglionic neuron, then releases acetylcholine to the postsynaptic ganglion, which contains nicotinic receptors, that then will continue to pass that signal, that stimulus, through the acetylcholine, which binds to the muscarinic receptor. So that's the parasympathetic pathway. The sympathetic pathway, okay, in the sympathetic pathway, the pre-ganglionic neuron will secrete what neurotransmitter? All pre-ganglionic neurons secretes this neurotransmitter. What would it be? Acetylcholine. The post-ganglionic neuron will always have what type of receptor? Nicotinic receptor. Okay. Now, as it moves down to its effector, in the post-ganglionic neuron, now it's going to release what? Because it's a sympathetic pathway. What neurotransmitter?
Norepinephrine.
Yes. And if it's norepinephrine, it's going to have to bind to what generic type of receptor?
Adrenergic.
Yes. There are two types of adrenergic receptors. What are they?
Alpha and beta.
Yes. Oh my God, so happy. Yes, alpha and beta. Perfect. And depending on these receptors, that's going to determine the effect, whether it's inhibitory or
Excitatory.
yes, you got it. You got it. Whew. Okay. Now there is one exception to the sympathetic pathway, and that's the adrenal sympathetic pathway. Why? Because it goes to the adrenal gland. Okay. So because it goes to the adrenal gland, okay, it still has the preganglionic neuron. The preganglionic neuron will release what neurotransmitter? Because all preganglionic neuron releases this neurotransmitter.
Cholinergic.
Yes, absolutely, acetylcholine. Because cholinergic is the same thing. It's used interchangeably. Okay? Which means that it's going to bind to what receptor?
Nicotinic.
Yep. And here's where it differs. Here it's going to release epinephrine, which is a version of norepinephrine. Then that travels through the blood and still has the same N receptor though, right? What type of N receptor would this have? Generic type. Because it's still binding to the beta receptors, either beta 1 or beta 2, but it's still what type of generic receptor?
Adrenergic.
Yes, you got it. Oh, you got it. That's it. That's exactly it. Okay? All right. Whew. Okay. So you can see that the alpha receptors are the most common, even though you have the beta and the alpha, but the alpha is most common. And whenever we talk about alpha and beta, we're always talking about the sympathetic pathway, okay? Just like we saw here. The sympathetic pathway, regardless of whether it's the sympathetic pathway or the adrenal sympathetic pathway, it always uses the alpha. It uses mostly the alpha, and then it does use beta as well, okay? And then this just kind of goes through the effects of it. All right, so here's the one where it involves the beta. So you can see that in beta, it can, for example, it can cause smooth muscle relaxation. It can cause increased heart rate. Okay, so here's the activity, just to make sure you understand things, okay? So for each site in this figure, where an autonomic nervous transmitter acts, okay, I want you to write N if it's nicotinic receptor, M if it's muscarinic receptor, and then alpha and beta if it acts as an adrenergic receptor. Okay, so go ahead and think it through. Where would you put the N, M, and alpha / beta? And you can talk to each other too. We're almost there. You only have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 slides left.
Professor Vu, are we writing on the screen?
No, you're just thinking about it, and then because I don't think you have access to the screen because it's a regular PowerPoint and not a Google PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering.
Yeah, but if you can take a screenshot and then you can write on that if you like. Okay, are we ready to do it as a class, or you want more time to think about it? Someone put in the chat. Let's see. Can we just write wherever? Yep, you can write wherever. Yep. Okay. For the sake of time, where would you put N? Where would you put N? Let's start with the easy one. Let's do the parasympathetic. So in the parasympathetic one, where would I put N? Nicotinic, nicotinic receptors. You know this, right? Because all preganglionic neuron uses nicotinic receptors. So where would the N be?
Acetylcholine.
Yes, there would be one right here. There would be one right here. And there'd be one right here. Why? Because all preganglionic, these are preganglionic, this is a preganglionic, this is a preganglionic neuron. This is the one before, okay? Pre meaning before. So all of these are preganglionic, and because they're all preganglionic, they release acetylcholine, which binds to nicotinic receptors. That's why all three have N after the preganglionic neuron. Yes, no, maybe so? Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. M, where would you put M? The muscarinic receptors. M would go where? There's only one place it can go. Because the muscarinic receptor only binds with what?
Will it only go on the parasympathetic one?
Yeah, yes. It only binds with acetylcholine. So M is right here. Alpha beta would go where?
Sympathetic.
Yes. Perfect. Very good. Hopefully it's starting to make a little bit more sense. Okay. So that's where you would put it. The M with the acetylcholine, because M is the parasympathetic, always. Alpha beta is adrenergic receptors, which is alpha and beta, and that always goes with the norepinephrine and epinephrine. Okay, and technically you put an N here too, because that's the although it only has one neuron, if it releases acetylcholine, it would be nicotinic receptor. Okay. Whew. Okay, questions? All right. So this is just to show you the same thing we actually already talked about it earlier about the green boxes shows you the opposing effects: constricting, dilation, stimulatory, inhibitory, decrease, increase. So these are opposing effects, and that's the point of the dual innervation. Okay. Some are cooperative, such as the penis and the vagina, and then any of the other is just there's no effect because both of them are not innervated. Only one is. Okay. All right. So there's a few last concepts I want to cover before we go. One of them is the sympathetic and parasympathetic tone. Okay. The tone. So what does that mean? So depends on which one. So with the sympathetic vasomotor tone, it's essentially the state of where the blood vessels are always partially constricted. Okay. And if you want to increase or decrease your blood pressure, you would either send a message to either have the signals fire more rapidly or slower. Okay. But the blood vessels are always partially vasoconstricted. And that's the tone. Okay. Just like you studied about the tone in your muscles. Okay. Muscle always has some tone to it, and that's why you're not slouched on the floor because your back always has maintains some tonus to it. So viscerally, okay, in other words, your smooth muscle and your cardiac muscle also has a type of tone. So if it's receiving signal from the sympathetic nervous system, we call it the sympathetic vasomotor tone. And what does that refer to? It refers to your blood vessels always being kind of, contracted or partially contracted. And if you want to increase blood pressure, would you increase the speed in which the signals are fired or decrease the signals?
Increase.
So if you increase the signals, what would happen?
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, not a problem. Okay. So my question is, if your blood pressure is high, okay, if your blood pressure is high, would you want the sympathetic vasomotor signals to be fired faster or slower if your blood pressure is high?
Slower.
Yes. Slower means dilation, right? And then, because your blood pressure is high, so you want your blood vessels to dilate and slow down the blood pressure, okay? Where the parasympathetic tone, this one is making sure that you maintain normal function of your gastrointestine as well as your urinary tract, okay? So in addition to that, the parasympathetic tone tends to keep your heart rate lower unless all of a sudden something happens and startles you, or you go running, or you do something that requires more your heart to beat faster. Okay, so these are two examples of tone that is maintained in your visceral organs, specifically your blood vessel, which is always partially constricted, or maintaining your gastrointestinal. So it's not like your digestive system just stops, right? It always continuously, slowly digests things, okay? As well as your urinary tract activity, okay? And your heart rate is normally lower than normal unless you're like being more active. Does that make sense? So that's what tone means. Think of it as like, you know how you learned about your muscle tonus, okay? Same thing, but this is with visceral, okay? All right. Then another concept is that there's unique roles to the sympathetic division itself. So just the sympathetic, not the parasympathetic, so just with the sympathetic division, it does three things. Thermoregulatory, in other words, it responds to heat. Okay. It releases renin, and you learned about renin already, yeah? No, you haven't. We haven't talked about the urinary system yet. Okay. So renin is an enzyme that will lead to the secretion of hormones that will increase blood pressure. Okay, so renin is the first step in the multiple step process that will help you to increase blood pressure. Okay. Another role of the sympathetic division is that it has a role in the metabolic effects. Okay, so it can either increase metabolic rates, it can raise your blood glucose levels, as well as convert fats into energy. Why are all of these metabolic effects a part of the sympathetic division? Why would you want to increase metabolic rates or increase blood glucose levels or convert fats into energy?
Is it if you're active?
Yeah, absolutely. You're active and you are preparing to, to do something serious like fighting or running. Okay, so absolutely. Okay. And then finally, our last thing is the role of the level of autonomic nervous system control. Okay, so in this one, you can see that the autonomic nervous system is usually associated with the hypothalamus, right? Because the hypothalamus functions in the overall control of the autonomic nervous system. So even though the hypothalamus is the control center, what has a direct effect on the autonomic nervous system itself is the brainstem. Okay, so although the hypothalamus is the main integration center, it's actually the brainstem that has the most direct influence over the autonomic functions. And you'll learn, no, you've already learned that. You've already learned about the structures of the brain. So what part of the brainstem is responsible for, let's say, breathing rates? Do you remember? Let's start with the three parts of the brainstem. What are the three parts of the brainstem?
Is the medulla oblongata one of them?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely. And you named a really important one too. What's the other two?
The pons and the midbrain.
Yes, thank you. So the pons is known as the pneumotoxic center, and that's the one that kind of keeps you breathing, right? Keeps you breathing on. Okay, where the medulla oblongata has effects on your respiratory as well as cardiovascular rates, your heart rate. So you can see that it's actually the brainstem, specific parts of the brainstem, that's actually sending the signal to the parasympathetic and sympathetic pathways to the specific effector organs. The hypothalamus may control the signals to the brainstem, but the direct path is from the brainstem to the effector organs. All right, now that's the green part. Okay, so all that green is, what we know to be associated with the autonomic nervous system. But you can see in this picture that even though the green portions, the hypothalamus, the brainstem, and the spinal cord have dominant roles in the autonomic nervous system, you can see that the cerebral cortex, as well as the limbic system, can influence and send signals to the hypothalamus to trigger the brainstem as well. So what am I talking about? So the cerebral cortex, or your frontal lobe, does a lot of your somatic, right? And the limbic system does a lot within emotion. So what kind of emotion do you think would trigger the hypothalamus to activate the brainstem to send a signal to your effector? What's a really strong emotion that will lead to either the parasympathetic or the sympathetic, mostly the sympathetic?
Would it be fear?
Yes, absolutely. Right? So that kind of connects to that example that I gave you. So I'm walking in the middle of the night in a dark alley, right? It's the fear of something happening that's sent to my thalamus, and the thalamus sends a signal to my muscles, right, to contract and prepare for for something to jump at me, right? So that's just to show you that even though we study the autonomic nervous system as kind of its own division or classification, the other parts, the cerebral cortex, which is the somatic, and the limbic, which is the emotional, also can influence the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so one more thing, I want to go back to this really quick. So we talked about this, but you did your group activity, so I forgot to continue it. So in the key differences between the autonomic nervous systems, okay, and did you memorize the 12 cranial nerves?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So which cranial nerve is this one right here that will come out and affect the heart, the lungs, the stomach, the pancreas, and the liver?
Vagus?
Yay! Yes. So a key point that you should know is that in the parasympathetic nervous system, majority of the signals that are being sent from the cranial site is through the vagus nerve. Okay. Then the lower, the reproductive and the urinary, is controlled by the sacral. Okay. Where in the sympathetic, it's the T1 through L4 that's really impacting those signals. So you kind of want to know, because in that assignment, I told you you should know the nerve as well as the effect. So that's why I'm just kind of wrapping it, pulling it in together. Okay. Any questions before we end?